I just came across this video, this article, and I want to talk about it. This from the Wall Street Journal. Let's flip over to it. Putin threatens arms race as the United States prepares to exit nuclear treaty. A few problems with this that I have with even the title of this article. It's not, how is it Putin threatening the arms race when it is the United States that's exiting the nuclear treaty? If it's indeed the United States is exiting the nuclear treaty, the response to that is not necessarily the other person's threatening. The very act of exiting the treaty is the threat itself. Here's the thing. When we're talking about politics or local or even international, it's not about right or wrong. It's often about cause and effect. People do things. They take certain actions in order to maintain a certain station. And many of those things, all sort of environmental factors, but they make choices that are in their best interest. And that could be in the best interest of the country. It could be in the best interest of the individual, but it is in their best interest. They go in a direction often of the incentives. In this particular situation, the United States, under Trump and under the maniac John Bolton, is deciding to exit the intermediate nuclear treaty, the intermediate range nuclear treaty. And I don't know how the Wall Street Journal turns around and says, this is Putin threatening this, when the United States is exiting. What is the response of the other country going to be? Why is the United States exiting the treaty? And is it exiting the treaty to not do nothing after it exits the treaty? If it's exiting the treaty, it's doing so because it wants to be able to produce these particular type of weapons, the very weapons that are expelled by the treaty itself. If they want to produce these weapons, then it's not Putin who's doing this, meaning from the standpoint of propagating an arms race. It is the person who's exiting the treaty, because they're exiting the treaty with this idea of creating those type of weapons. Any response to this can't be blamed on the person that's responding. It has to be blamed on the person that's doing it. Oftentimes, the media in the United States takes a United States perspective. I ask the individuals on my channel to take more of an internationalist perspective. I often make the term sitting on the moon, looking at the world. And while this is not to necessarily hug Putin, like the guy said, he's not necessarily an honest actor. In this particular case, let's be honest, the United States is the one that's pulling out of the treaty, and it's pulling out of the treaty because it wants to create those type of weapons. Here's 2 points. And let's go to the article first. But Putin puppet Trump, who supposedly was working with Vladimir Putin, who we've been told by the Democratic Party is arm in arm with Putin, who's a mini Putin. There's these little dolls where Donald Trump is in the bottom, even though Putin is at the bottom of Donald Trump, and all this other stuff. All of this stuff that we've been told, that Trump and Russia are hand in hand, arm in arm, they're bros. Trump never criticizes Putin. These people are on the same page. They're having an arms race. They're talking about having an arms race. Are you serious? Your Putin puppet is now creating policies, is pulling out of treaties, and treaties that has kept this country and the countries in Europe secure over the past 40, 50 years. Do you realize that Europe is dramatically against this? Even elements of the Pentagon was dramatically against this. Maniac John Bolton, however, is not. John Bolton has famously been against these type of treaties, and he is whispering in Donald Trump's ear. For all of these people who are Trump supporters, who think this guy is some kind of peacenik, what is this? What is this? Also, to the people who are pushing this angle of Donald Trump being a Putin puppet, what is this? Do you think this is kabuki theater, where they're doing this just to kind of... This is not kabuki theater. Do you realize that we've been fortunate, and it's been dumb luck that we've existed to this point? That's not my perspective of things. That's Daniel Ellsberg's perspective of things. We have gotten to this point through dumb luck. I've gone over the Cuban Missile Crisis on more than one occasion. Even getting through that by itself, there were misperceptions on both sides of Soviet Union and of the Kennedy administration in regards to this kind of nuclear standoff that these guys were on. This is dramatically dangerous. They're not fucking around. John Bolton is not put into that position for shits and giggles. John Bolton is put into that position for a neocon perspective of the world and international politics. And they could lead us into a war. There is a certain brinksmanship that is going on in regards to how the United States and Russia is playing this. My point here is, look at the world for the moment, not from the perspective of the United States, but from the perspective of Russia. That country has been invaded on more than one occasion by Western forces. Even we had military in there trying to put the Tsar back in. And in those invasions, they've lost millions of people. Now, you would imagine if you've been in a situation where 10 million people was lost in one war, I think 20 million was lost in a second war, in another war, you would be a little sketchy about your borders. The United States put out a joint resolution or a joint statement with the Ukraine, a Ukraine that was severed off and carved up by Western powers that provoked a revolution in that country and backed an unelected government that was taken over by, to some degree, of force, and supported Nazis in their pursuit of killing Russians. And put out a joint resolution or joint statement saying that they wanted Ukraine to be a NATO nation, which is putting a hostile entity on the border of Russia. This is dramatically dangerous. I guess I'm making a point here is, if your country has been invaded multiple times, you will be sketchy about your borders. There are cultural differences in each of these countries, and one of those cultural recognitions is we've been invaded and millions of our people have been killed. If you don't believe that there are cultural differences, I just had a conversation with a guy who's in Poland. And in having a conversation, he made reference to the Soviet Union occupying that country and this kind of hatred and animosity that they have in response to that. I, as an American, even though I may be aware that that took place, in no way could touch and objectively understand the cultural significance of what he went through as a kid growing up in that country, or the cultural understanding of relationship they have with Russia in this case. I would make the same argument that as a person sitting on the moon, Russia would be sketchy about its borders. We were willing to destroy the world in the Cuban Missile Crisis with missiles being on our borders. We've surrounded that country with missiles. Despite saying that at the end of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev being to some degree conned, that hostilities would cease, that NATO would not expand, and that there would be a certain degree of peace. Not so much. We assisted Yeltsin getting elected. Yeltsin was a drunk, and Yeltsin dragged that country through the mud with hundreds of thousands, I think over 100,000 or more, dying as a result of the programs that he was instituting, pushed by the West. Not to mention there were people who were in the United States who got magnificently wealthy off of what Yeltsin was doing in that country. I hate the title of this article. The Russiagators emboldened this behavior. That's the other point I want to make before getting to the article. Russiagate emboldens this behavior. When you're criticizing somebody, that criticism, oftentimes in a political space, the person doesn't necessarily want to embody the criticism by behaving in the way that the criticism is saying. It depends on the person, it depends on what it is and what that person stands for. But oftentimes, especially for New Deal Democrats and these guys who are, who are, Democrats don't like to be called tax and spend, or they don't like to be called weak. And so they become reflexively more hawkish on foreign policy. The same thing is true with Republicans, especially from the standpoint of Trump. They've screamed and howled that Trump was a Putin puppet, that everything that he was doing was at the behest of Vladimir Putin. And what does that do? That in order to not embody what they're saying, even if he wanted to come into office being more conciliatory towards Russia, opening up a new level of relationship between the two countries that brings down hostilities, it is impossible in a climate where everything that he does is put through the lens of Donald Trump working with Putin. When Donald Trump said, we're going to pull troops out of Syria, oh, you can't pull troops out of Syria. He's doing this because of Vladimir Putin. That is him actively trying to lower the hostilities, with the Democrats screaming that this is in some way is at the behest of Vladimir Putin. When he didn't push through those sanctions, and the first thought is, well, the pushing through those sanctions would have meant that there was some delegitimization of his own presidency. They didn't look at that through that lens. That makes all the sense in the world that nobody in their right mind wants to push through sanctions that would essentially say they got into office at the behest of somebody else and not on their own steam. That would be nonsense for anybody to do. What was the language? Oh, he's a Putin puppet. He's trying to help Vladimir Putin. That's why he's not doing this. Everything is put through that lens of Russia working with Putin. This is politics. That's a political stunt per se, but that's a political stunt that pushes us closer to the brink of a fuck up, or at the very least, a conflict. For fuck's sake. During the Vietnam War, the United States took the perspective that we're fighting communists. The Vietnamese took the perspective that you're trying to be occupiers and you're trying to take over where the French left off. These are two dramatically different perspectives of what was taking place. Robert McNamara, having a conversation with, I think it was Ho Chi Minh, 30, 40 years after the war, made this point to him that we weren't going to allow you to take over our land. McNamara making the point, we weren't trying to take over your land. This is a dramatic difference in perspective, but this difference can never be understood because the United States didn't care about what the Vietnamese perspective was. They were doing what they wanted to do because they considered themselves as a superior power. Well, they lost that war. They lost that war. Let's take a look at this. I'm saying the perspective of others matter, especially if you're trying to tamp down this idea of conflict. The thing that will definitely provoke a certain conflict is if the only perspective that you take is that of your particular individual country, when your country could be wrong. Your country could be wrong. And the other country could have a certain perspective that is legitimate, even if you don't necessarily like the individual that's in the head of the country. Putin threatens arms race with the United States as it prepares to exit nuclear treaty. Right here. U.S. officials last year said the Pentagon had begun work on preliminary research and development of nuclear weapons aimed at potentially reviving the arsenal of the type prohibited under the treaty. They said Moscow has been informed of U.S. progress in order to pressure Russia into compliance with the 1987 treaty. Now, this is he said, she said. Both countries accuse the other of being a violation of the treaty. What is true, and what we do know, is that NATO has expanded after the president, I think it was George Bush, said it wouldn't expand. That's one fail. It's expanded around Russia and China, for that matter. Missiles, missile systems, weapon systems, military personnel has expanded around Russia borders. That's what we know. The Ukraine is considering joining NATO. That's also something we know, or at the very least pushing to get to a point where they can join NATO. There are Nazis walking through the streets of the Ukraine and they're talking about adding that to NATO. That's fucking insane. They are literally in hostilities right now. If Ukraine was part of NATO and there was hostilities between the two, every last country, including the United States, would have to activate their military in order to go to war, which would end up being a nuclear war, because no country is going to allow themselves to be taken down. We do know Russia created a new class of nuclear missile systems, but those new class of missile systems had to do with this thing of circling their country. It's as if the United States wants them to just lay down and don't move. And that's nonsense. This country has taken a military policy where we would not allow another country like the Soviet Union to spring up, which means that any country that wants to control its own sphere of influence will be at odds with the United States' global domination of the world. It is not the other country at that point that is provoking war. It is the United States policy that it pushes. That is with Democratic presidents and Republican presidents. Just saying. Russia says Washington's accusations are groundless and that Moscow has tried numerous times to prove it was abiding by the treaty. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rabinov said last month it tested the 9M729 cruise missiles in the past, but it ranges below those banned under the nuclear deal. What's probably true about that is that those missiles may or may not be under the deal, but at the same token, I don't necessarily believe that the United States is probably fully abiding by the treaty either, and that some of those missile systems that are considered quote-unquote defensive, can easily be converted into offensive missiles that can hit that country. Let's be honest. Let's be honest. Neither of these countries are honest actors. Let's be honest. I would like to transmit the message through your superiors that the INF agreement broken, our side will respond. Now, right here. Russian President Vladimir Putin raised the prospect of an arms race with the United States on Wednesday in response to Washington's warning it could suspend Cold War-era treaty that prohibits intermediate or shorter-range nuclear missiles. The United States has accused Russia of violating the treaty on intermediate-range nuclear force, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said on Tuesday that Washington would freeze its commitments under the treaty in 60 days if Russia didn't comply with the pact. Russia denies it has violated the treaty. Mr. Putin said Russia will respond accordingly if the United States withdrew from the agreement, and indicated that Moscow will follow through with the development and construction of shorter intermediate-range weapons if the United States sought to construct the weapons. Our American partners apparently believe that the situation has changed to such an extent that the United States should have such weapons, said Mr. Putin, speaking on TV. What answer will they have from outside? It's simple. We'll do it too. Of course they'll do it too. All countries, any country, no country is going to allow, that said, if they can disallow another country to get a superiority over them, especially if that's going to be lauded over them and used in order to control the level of events going on around the world. In the same sense, if you have a gun, I need a gun, at least speaking from the standpoint of international politics. If you have a gun, I need a gun, because if you have a gun, you can essentially point that gun at me and my knife is going to not be up to the task. The same thing with this idea of Space Force is going to create a nuclear or an arms race in space. Of course it's going to create an arms race in space. If you're trying to get global dominance of space, we are forced into the same pattern in order to make sure that we can have a certain degree of self-determination of our country and that we're not going to be under the thumb of your interests. This is dramatically dangerous rhetoric that is taking place. And the idea that this guy is supposedly some kind of Putin puppet, he's arming Nazis in the Ukraine, and he's firing off weapons into Syria, despite the fact that Russia is in that particular area, and that is within their domain of influence, and that the United States has no legal jurisdiction to even be in the country in the first place. And in this case, this is saber rattling. If you pull out the treaty and you start building weapons, we're going to start building weapons. And the Russiagators have this wrong. Some of us have this wrong just because they're useful idiots. Others are pushing forward a political narrative where they don't necessarily care whether it's true or false. They're just throwing this stuff out there in order for some kind of bait of sorts, so to get people hooked on and give them an argument that they can throw at Donald Trump. Kind of like right-wingers calling Obama a Trotskyist or a communist, socialist, and all this other stuff. The guy, they gave 95% of the wealth to the top 1%. They got calling the guy a communist. This is not good. This is not indicative of bringing down hostilities with Russia. This is not indicative of this guy being a Putin puppet. I never understood this notion that he was a Putin puppet. And I think their context is completely, dramatically wrong. This is dangerous. We've gotten this far just by luck. Let's see who's here now in this one, because this one has gone longer than I expected. Russians are not communists anymore. No, they're not. No, they're not. They're talking about fight communism. There's no communism. The Russians are communists. Communism is about it. The Russians are communists. I don't know what you're talking about. Treating me fine. How is Putin the most powerful, dangerous, manipulative, evildoer in the world? Russia is not Soviet Union anymore. No, they're not. And they're more powerful than China, Saudi Arabia, $800 billion defense budget. They spend a fraction of their money on their military. Like, the amount of money that we raised our military budget by is more than their entirety of their military budget. And yet they're acting like, these guys are a major threat. It's nonsense. Everybody wants to have something outside of themselves as being the thing that they can pivot to or point to that's a problem, as opposed to dealing with the issues that are affecting the country itself. I would say deal with the matters at home. I'll leave this here. All right, guys. If you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through PayPal or Patreon. Thanks all.